All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Rowena, for the invitation to come speak about my first book, which is right on your screen. It was published, I can't remember when now, 2009, so it feels like a little while ago. But I loved it dearly, and I love it dearly still, so I'm very, very happy to have a chance to talk about it and to connect it to the theme of my lecture, which is derived from one chapter of the book, chapter 5. I'd like to talk today about letter writing in the American Revolution in particular, since the American Revolution obviously is a signal event in this nation's history, and letter writing, I argue in the book, played a very important and underappreciated role in that revolution from a variety of perspectives. But I realized that before I dive into the revolution itself and think about the revolution itself, I should talk about what a letter looked like and what letter writing looked like and who wrote letters, and give you a basic sense of the letter and of communications in this time period, because it was rather dramatically different from the present day. And now, of course, we can read about Facebook and Twitter playing an important role in revolutions that are occurring in Tunisia and in Egypt, in our current events, and how important letter communications media are. And letter writing was a very important communications media, and a very new one in a lot of ways, in the 18th century, in the what we call the long 18th century, which really begins when time began and ends sometime in the future. We like to claim a lot for the 18th century. But still, it was rather different and rather new and exciting for many, many people in the 18th century. So I guess I'll try to do that. So I'd like to give you some of the background so we can just look at what a letter looks like, what people look like who wrote letters. I'm going to try to do this in 30 to 40 minutes. I had more material about, it's the invention of the writing desk, for instance. So I had a little section about the writing desk. There were no desks. Then people wrote on tables, and the desk was invented. But I'm omitting some things, and I'll leave lots of time in question and answer to maybe fill in some of the things I have to hasten past. And then finally, I'd like to especially talk about how letter writing fit into the revolution and was changed by the revolution, and then how I argue that letter writing changed the revolution itself. And with that in mind, here I'd just like to show you a couple of letters. First of all, I don't know how often you handle 18th century documents, but they're rather remarkable, and they are long-lasting. Much longer lasting than anything from the 19th century, because paper was still made out of linen and such things. So if you go into archives, and I went to many, many archives, I handled a lot of letters, invaded a lot of privacy in my research for 3 years or so. The letters are incredibly durable and strong in a lot of ways, and rather remarkable, whereas if you touch 19th century paper, it often crumbles even in your fingertips, and it's rather distressing when you take a book and you just go to open it and it starts crumbling right at the edge in your fingertips, and you just feel like you're destroying something very much by accident. This is a letter that was just an ordinary letter. This was the era before uniform spelling, so words are spelt very differently. It's the era before really a notion of uniform handwriting. There were different handwritings that were considered appropriate for different kinds of people. This person is writing to a brother who emigrated to Rhode Island, and just trying to get, the brother lives in Newport, Rhode Island. The letter is being sent to Boston, and the person hopes that the letter will somehow make its way to Newport, because there are very few, as I'll talk about in a moment, there are very few post offices or any other ways. Most letters were conveyed informally by people as a favor from one person to another, and you try to get the letter into the vicinity of where you're going. There's no such thing as a street address or an address, so you'll find addressing conventions are completely different. And you can see the handwriting is rather erratic, the ink application is rather erratic, the spelling is rather terrible, and it's a poignant and lovely letter from someone who hasn't seen their kinfolk in many, many years and is just trying to establish some sense of contact. There's another letter, just to show you a couple of examples. Here you can see this is just a few years later. This is a person who's slightly more educated and writing. This is a woman writing to her minister. or a minister that she had had in the past, actually, not her current minister, but remained friends with. And here you can see, if you look at the letter, the spelling is very erratic, the expressions are rather poignant, and the letter is just a remarkable and lovely document. And often it would be folded over, and the address would just simply be on the back, and the red seal, as you'll see in a moment. And the next image, I think, is going to be a beautiful one, yes? And here you can see there's a letter being held. Sorry, now I would like to move, but here's a letter being held with the red seal, always folded in such a way and sealed. And the first two letters I showed you are somewhat unusual in that they're written by women in the 18th century. And for whatever reason, women in the 18th, for enough of the 18th century, were not thought as being either strong or intelligent enough to be able to write. Beginning with, they weren't strong enough to be able to write, that reading was appropriate for women, but not writing. And so you'll see many, many portraits in this time period where here you can see this is a mercantile figure coated by the ship in the background. It is a male who always holds the letter, and the woman in these portrait pairs, husband and wife pairs, very exquisite by Copley. Copley did a whole bunch of these, coated in the same way, ship in the background of a man holding a letter or writing at a table or a desk, and the woman looking beautiful and radiant in her way, and associated with something other than letter. The next image I'll show you a slightly less beautiful painter. But here you can see the coating. There's the man sitting at the writing desk. Often there are some books, writing table actually, often some books around, looking rather masterful. And there's the woman with the images of fecundity, both her own children and the fruit. And women, one of the conventions becomes when women are encouraged to read more and more is the finger in the book. They're often shown holding a book with their finger in it as if they're being interrupted reading. And that's a permissible object. It's really not until the 19th century that women are shown at the act of writing, even though it's in the 18th century where to encourage women to write and to write letters becomes more commonplace by the middle of the century, and certainly by the end of the century, which I talk about in other parts of my book. But this kind of imagery, these portrait pairs, I found not dozens but hundreds of them in England and in this part of the world by colonial artists like Peel and Copley, and by English artists who established all the conventions, where this coding happens over and over. And that, I can't remember, maybe the next image has the cover of the book. Yes, this is 1804. This is a lovely rising Baltimore family. This is the first African-American portrait artist in the United States who has a lot of surviving portraits. And even here you can see it's the woman on a sofa, but the woman is associated with the children, and it's the man who holds the connection to the greater world. The woman is associated with domesticity, and the male is associated with something greater than the family. And the son is being, here you can see the son is being indoctrinated into the same attitude, and the daughter is being indoctrinated into the same attitude of where they stand relative to the world. So this really doesn't change. I found some lovely portraits in the 19th century, and then the encouragement of children to write letters. Actually, this is part of the beginning of bringing children into the world of letter writing. There's a beautiful painting by Charles Eastman from the Civil War, which is Letter Home from Daddy, who's the soldier at the war, and it's a child who's reading the letter. And that sentimentalization of childhood and the communication between adults and children happens increasingly in the 19th century. But this is an 18th century lineage that's going to change some of the pressures. I think I can show you the next slide. Besides the letter as an object, and I'll talk about conveyance again for a moment because that will lead me into the story of the revolution itself. People learned how to write letters in different ways. This is sort of a classic text published by Ben Franklin and reprinted many, many times, both in England and in this part of the world. And it was the classic manual to teach young men how to make their way into the world and be effective and succeed. And you can see it's the American Instructor, Young Man's Best Companion, containing spelling, reading, writing, and arithmetic, et cetera, instructions to write a variety of hands, for instance, to learn how to do merchant accounting, to learn how to be their own healthcare provider, and other things. And these kinds of manuals, especially for young men entering the business world, were a classic genre of the early 18th century, really, and became popular, being with Ben Franklin publishing this work by the mid-century in this part of the world, i.e. the future United States. So these books assume a male universe, and that only they have lots of sample letters, for instance, and all of the sample letters that young men are expected to write are to other men. There's no imagination that women are part of the social universe, never mind the economic universe. That will change with the next book, this is the very, very famous Samuel Richardson, who wrote two extraordinary novels in the middle of the 18th century in England, which became enormously popular on both sides of the Atlantic. They're very hefty novels premised simply on a narrative structured around letter after letter after letter, one called Pamela and one called Clarissa, and the tension that builds from being able to be the prying eyes and seeing the secret correspondence of someone and their negotiation of the world and what they know and what they don't know. And of course you see other letters, and so you're always navigating different bits of information that different letter writers know, and that creates the narrative tension that will carry you through many, many hundreds of pages. But he also wrote this book, which became very popular and it really inspired a new kind of letter manual, which is to write the familiar letter, not the business letter, and not the literary letter, which had been an aristocratic genre in the 17th century, but this is the familiar letter for every social occasion. And this book emphatically includes women, and more books like this appear in the middle of the 18th century, and imagine a social universe in which both men and women, in order to participate in that social universe, should and must write letters to be effective in the social world, whether that social world is a business one or the world of friendship, and how these worlds overlap with each other, interconnect and overlap with each other. And there's increasingly a notion that this is what's important, that you have to learn how to navigate every social moment and to do it properly in order to be a proper person in the world. So there's a great bourgeois middle class thrust to these letters, and their social world. Richardson is important because he really truncates that social world. He eliminates the aristocracy from the book very much, and he eliminates poor people from the book. And he really shows a social middle that becomes more and more important in how a social world is understood in England as the middle class is growing very, very concertedly in this time period. And it has its appeal among the small urban and the large rural middle class in this part of the world. And this will expand that social universe quite a bit. Here I just give you one quick example of this trend. This is an evening school for young ladies where you can see they can begin to be taught writing, arithmetic, and accounting, for instance. And these are the new skills that are now, for some reason, considered appropriate for women, not to bring them into the business world so much, but simply if you are going to be a proper bourgeois, middle-class woman, you should really know how to do some writing and some math and some accounting. And you can see this is an evening school, just a few hours a week, a few weeks of the year, but this was considered the extent of what was necessary.
Psalmody? What is that?
Oh, singing, sorry. Yes, so it's often attached to quote-unquote ornamental skills like singing and sewing and other things. These schools navigate both worlds. But this is new, this is an innovation. This is a school teacher who decides he can feed a new market of people who are interested in educating their daughters and turning their daughters into effective social creatures, a new understanding of what an effective social creature was. So I'll just give you one example of something that happens quite concertedly in the middle of the 18th century. I do have a couple of desks just to give you a sense of how people wrote. This is a precursor to the laptop in some ways. And actually, I forgot, I should have, there's a famous, you might recognize there's a famous, Thomas Jefferson used one of these, a very modern version to write the Declaration of Independence, for instance. So there's a famous one in the Smithsonian that you can still look at, which has lots of gadgets. But this is this would be a desk for many people. The beginning of the notion of storing documents. People didn't have documents in their homes or on their persons. This is the invention of the pocketbook, for instance, in the 18th century, which is a mail accessory, not a female accessory. It's men who carry pocketbooks. It's men who are carrying documents for the most part of all sorts. So the pocketbook becomes something, there are lots of advertisements in the newspaper about lost pocketbooks, that men are constantly losing their pocketbooks in the 18th century. If you go on a little further, the desk is going to evolve a little bit. This is a little bit fancier. The notion that the table is not the default piece of furniture anymore. Homes are getting larger and are capable of accommodating more specialized furniture, and this is a more specialized piece of furniture, which some people choose to invest in when, for most people, they can write on a table, and perhaps with a desk box if they want to store their letters and other documents. And this is a little more. The next image is a more beautiful, classic desk that you see. This is a cruder version of some very, very beautiful ones. I wanted to show you something on the more ordinary rather than the more spectacular level. But this becomes more common by the middle of the 18th century, and it becomes more specialized. And then you get desks that are designed for women and desks that are designed for men. For instance, there are wood cabinet making manuals, for instance, that differentiate the kinds of furniture that are supposedly for women and the kinds of designs that are supposedly for women and for men. So this appears increasingly in homes as a place to store documents and as a place to write, as homes again get a little bit larger, some of them anyway, and can accommodate these aspirations and resources. This is an important document. It's the first British document. I should give you a little background. There's a lot of, the only way to describe this is knowledge of the colonies that's peddled in England that's not very knowledgeable, shall we say. And there's, for a long time, in much of the 17th century into the 18th century, there wasn't that much interest in the colonies. They weren't that lucrative. They were very marginal in terms of the British economy. But that interest is going to change in the 18th century, and there's an attempt to gather more knowledge. And this is the first book of maps and other things which actually mentions that there's a postal service linking Boston to Philadelphia, especially in this time period. And I think I give you a close-up on the next piece here. And this is the first map that shows that there is a crude postal system. There's a rather extraordinary postal system already in England that grows at the end of the 17th century and is remarkable by the early 18th century. The one in the colonies is very, very fragmentary, shall we say. And this is the first appreciation that there is an infrastructure developing in the colonial part of the world, and that they are starting to gain in economic potential and of being of greater interest to English officials, English merchants, et cetera, et cetera. And this is going to be the era of tremendous change in the economic relationship between the colonies and Britain, where the colonies occupy a much more important space in the imperial economy. And this is the first appreciation of something. These fragments, this really starts, this postal system starts as an idea in 1692. It really doesn't take shape until 1710, and even now it happens maybe weekly between Boston and New York and Philadelphia, the most densely populated areas in the colonies, and there's really no hope to have a southern branch anywhere below Philadelphia. That happens in the decades to come and is really a product of what Benjamin Franklin and an associate of his, James Parker, are able to do in the 1750s and 1760s. But here at least there's an appreciation of this, and it's this postal system which is going to bring me to the American Revolution. So, actually one more. So here, this is a table of rates. You paid by distance in this time period as well as by weight. And so this is, you can't see this unfortunately, but there are the locations here, and just you follow the table and you connect the price of a letter and figure out, and there's just, I forget, they're not even, I think this is the 1763, there are 48 or 64, I can't remember, post offices. Supposedly, many of them aren't quite functioning, as they discover in 1773 when the British Empire finally surveys the postal system and they send someone to investigate what it all actually looks like. And the investigator is quite surprised by what he finds, which is not much functioning. And then he gets overwhelmed by the revolution in interesting ways. But at least there's an attempt and there's a notion that you can convey mail, especially if you have extra material resources in the form of money, that you can convey mail by a postal system more reliably than you can by asking a neighbor who happens to be going to that town, which is within 80 miles of that town, to carry a letter to that town, which is what people were doing both on a transatlantic basis, given the connections between England and Great Britain and the colonies, and from colony to colony as people moved to the backcountry and as people moved from place to place, which they did quite frequently. The effort to communicate was quite important and was quite difficult. And this will lead me to the revolutionary story. Because one of the key dimensions of the revolution is that one of the first things that they begin to do, William Goddard is the author of this piece, and he imagines that one of the first things that should be the postal system. And you can see he uses the word American, which is a rare word, even as late as 1774, in American newspapers and magazines. And he imagines that the imperial postal system should be taken over in order to provide secure communications, both for letters and especially for newspapers. He's a newspaper publisher, and newspapers were conveyed through the postal system. He was very concerned about this, and he imagines that as an early revolutionary gesture, the imperial postal system should be taken over by the colonies. And William Godward's plans intersect with that surveyor who the British Empire had sent just innocently in 1773 to go survey the entire colony. So the surveyor does not finish the job. Goddard imagines that he's going to be leader of the new American Post Office. He's very disappointed, when Benjamin Franklin comes home from London after many, many years of service at the court, the royal court in London. And Benjamin Franklin is given the postmastership that William Goddard wanted. And here I should just pause, because here we have to think a little bit differently of the relationship between an empire and colonies and how empires might work, given that how the American empire works in the present day. The British Empire is a very, very different entity, and here this empire was premised on really a settler society. There are indigenous people, obviously, in this part of the world who are pushed aside and cast aside, but there is an effort to populate a place, which is very different, for instance, from how the American Empire works. We don't populate colonies. They have not since earlier in the 20th century. But the British Empire was very, very keen to populate colonies as it's a leading mechanism of empire that it adopts in the 17th century, and certainly becomes much more confident in, given the extraordinary success of the colonies, economic success of the colonies in the 18th century. The other complicating, now that we're reading about the complexities of Tunisia and Egypt in the news, the other complexity is the revolution, especially the American Revolution, which faces many, many different directions. It faces across the Atlantic to England and a relationship to England. There are many people in England who do not want to wage a war against the colonies, for instance, because they have uncles and brothers and sisters that they don't want to really kill, surprisingly enough. There are many people in the colonies who don't want to participate in a war for the same reason, as well as for other reasons. There are also a lot of tensions within the colonies, and there's a lot of conflict between colonists as a consequence of this war. In Britain, it doesn't turn into a revolution. Britons don't fight Britons on the soil of Britain, but colonists do fight colonists on the soil of this part of the world. And so the War of Independence is only part of a story. The War of Independence that might face England is only part of a much greater revolution in this time period that faces many, many different directions. And the lines of conflict, I want to emphasize, also go in many, many different directions. The other thing about a revolution is that it requires, like the war that is a part of it, an extraordinary amount of organization to be effective, as we just see in these partially effective and ineffective revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt. And here is where I want to make an argument for the importance of letter writing and of communications, and actually of our friend Mr. Goddard, who has the imagination that one of the things you do is you take over the communications system that is an imperial one, that is in the hands of people you disagree with. And William Goddard does that. And so the postal system and letter writing both become politicized. They are means of conducting business, for instance. They're means of connecting families who just want to stay in touch in whatever ways they become. They are not so much considered means of conducting politics, but every letter very, very quickly and every node of communication becomes intensely politicized as a consequence of the revolution, even before the war, in the brief period of revolution before the war. And so I want to talk about that politicization for a little while, and then I'll lead into how letter writing changed the revolution, but I guess we can go. So here's William Goddard writing, publishing another little broadside. This is a one-page sheet, which is handed out in the streets of New York to inspire people to take action. And it is action against the Royal Postmaster of New York City, John Foxcroft, whom William Goddard dislikes. And William Goddard wins against his former superior, actually, in the post office, because John Foxcroft is leaned upon, and by September, just a few months after this, the Royal Post Office in New York City is the last post office that's functioning, and the only thing it's doing is receiving mail from London. It is no longer receiving mail from Boston, because all the mail from Boston is being taken over by committees of safety and other organizations, and who create a new postal system in this time period. By December of 1775, and these dates are going to become important in a moment. I don't mind to bore you with dates, but you can start reading how they're important they are, because they're much earlier than we might expect. The British Post Office, the last Royal Post Office, closes. And this is a time period where people who made the attempt to publish British newspapers that favored the British received some unpleasant visits from people and had their presses destroyed and had their offices destroyed, had their homes destroyed, and had some of their persons destroyed in some cases. And this was also the case with post riders and postmasters, not just printers, who favored the British. And those experienced a significant clampdown. So next slide. So that by July 26th, 1775, the Continental Congress can take over the Imperial British postal system. And if you can see that date, this is a year before the Declaration of Independence. And the process of declaring independence is still light years away. There's no imagination, there's no discussion of it, there's no thought to it really until early 1776. And here they are making this extraordinarily decisive step to ratify what had already happened on the streets effectively, which is a takeover of the system and a shutting down of all of the local post offices that were once run by the imperial government and reported to Mr. Foxcroft. The other element to this is that letters everywhere are taken. Some letters are more interesting than others, but the British government, the American revolutionaries, the rebels, run committees of safety who take people's mail and look at the mail and see what people are writing and thinking. And the British government, of course, does the same thing, and they spend a lot of their resources trying to intercept mail. There's an office staffed by a number of people in London whose task it is to read a lot of mail and especially find the good stuff. Among the good stuff is to look at the letters. Among the favorite letters are the political leaders of the Continental Congress. This is John Adams writing to Abigail and being exposed in print. There are a number of famous instances of this where the British try to foment disagreement and dissent by publishing these embarrassing letters. There's a lot of effort. George Washington's letters are intercepted constantly and published in the newspaper, and he quickly learns to shrug at the matter, and he learns how to write multiple copies of his letters, et cetera, et cetera. And this is what ordinary people were subject to as well, where their thoughts were freighted, because earlier in the war, in the process of the revolution, it was very difficult to know whose side people were on, why they favored one side, what their thoughts were, and the revolution is something that escalated into a serious crisis. And at the beginning there was a slightly more forgiving tone if you disagreed and dissented, and that forgiving tone changed more to tarring and feathering by 1776 and became less forgiving. But letters became hugely, hugely important, I guess. And one of the places that became important is when the British abandoned Boston and took over New York City as their headquarters for a long time. And the Continental Congress spent a lot of its time trying to keep people from communicating with each other. And people, of course, tried to communicate with each other, some for political reasons, because there are people who fled and there are people who remained in secret. There are people who changed their minds. There were family members. And so I've studied the letters, especially, for instance, in this chapter, of Loyalist women who were fascinating because their husbands were in exile in New York City and they wanted to communicate with their husbands. They wanted to share all kinds of information, some of it political and some of it not. And there was a great insistence that nothing was more important than those letters. No one had a right to look at their correspondence. No committee of safety, nobody. And they spent a lot of time trying to smuggle letters in all kinds of creative ways, and to letters written anonymously. I looked at this one family, the shoemakers. They wrote their letters anonymously. They numbered their letters very carefully to make sure they were getting them in the right sequence. They spent a lot of time figuring out how to get the letters through a lot of military occupation and across lines from one side to the other. They had professions of innocence, that their letters were just family letters, and how dare anyone place anything that was more important than their family connections and the love that they felt for each other. And of course, some of them also played politics and shared important political information that wasn't available in other ways. And so this cat and mouse game happened for years around New York City and other places where the American rebels tried to cordon off British occupied areas. And this was probably the place. New Jersey became the most fiercely contested because the Continental Congress was in Philadelphia for a long time, the British headquarters was in New York, and New Jersey was in between the two, and there was a lot of letters flowing back and forth between the two. And so this process is a rather fascinating one. I think we can go to the next image, I think. Yeah. And so one of the interesting things about this is that women become politicized in a new way, that earlier women are looked upon as helpless figures of innocence. They're not political, they are maybe social creatures, they're nice ornaments, but the world of politics is a male domain, not a female domain. And increasingly what you see is this anger expressed by, let's say, the governor of New Jersey, William Livingston, that women they're traitors, and they're the ones that you have to be the most watchful of because they're causing the most trouble. They're sharing the political information, they have all the information, and they know how to get a letter through, and you can't pat them down. Or they do pat them down, and there's a lot of anger back and forth over this game. And so the status of communications changes in the takeover of the postal system. The status of letter writing changes because every letter has a political meaning, or it has to be tested for its political meaning. No letter can you can't trust anyone and say, this is only a letter about this. And letters are written in all kinds of code, et cetera, et cetera. And then women become politicized in a rather different way, if only to defy the government. The shoemakers are not that involved in politics, but all they care about is, I don't care if these laws say we cannot correspond, we want to correspond. I want to express my love for this person. And nothing should be permitted to stand in that way. And I will do so even if the government makes it against the law. And so they're only political insofar as to break those particular laws. The other set of letters that was fascinating were letters between the battlefront and the home front. And here I looked especially at rebel letters by junior officers and soldiers who just wanted to write home. And they wanted to write letters. And this is where the revolution changed letter writing, because letter writing was a difficult and a fairly expensive undertaking in a lot of ways, and you had to have a reason to do it. The fascinating thing about so many of the letters that I read from the battlefront to the home front and from the home front to the battlefront is they were about nothing. And they professed that they were about nothing. They just wanted to be in touch. And that's it. There was no information, no news, nothing, just a short letter to say, it's Valentine's Day, to say I love you, and that's it. And that's where the function of letter writing changed from having a purpose to having no purpose. It was just always a useful and good thing to do. And people became all kinds of people, the lowliest soldiers. I read the diary of a soldier who bargained ditch digging for being taught how to write so that he could write letters, for instance. People wanted to write letters, and it became a much more, in strange circumstances of war, it became much more of a normal thing to do. And the quantity of letters that circulated between battlefront and home front and across the Atlantic in this time period are extraordinary. I mean, George Washington, for instance, is one instance, writes over 12,000 letters during the course of the war, for instance, or signs over 12,000 letters, which you can see is a number a day. Benjamin Franklin's letters are in the thousands upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands. There's still, people wrote an extraordinary amount, and increasingly what you see is more ordinary people not writing. What I used to see in letters is an annual letter. They would write an annual letter to somebody. Now they're imagining they should write more often and in different ways, and that's how the revolution changes letter writing in turn. The other thing that happens is that it's not just loyalist women who make a choice between family and politics. It is also these rebel soldiers under George Washington who have fatigue, shall we say, and limited stamina and want to be home and have things to take care of at home. And they're always confronted with the dueling responsibilities. Do you do this public service of participating in this grand military effort that's going to save your country, or do you save your farm? Because your farm is just going downhill and it might not survive if you stay that much longer. And so these imperatives of patriarchy especially are worked out, and there's a lot of concern that a lot of men are prioritizing their families over their country, as it were. Because they're going home to their farms and they're abandoning the cause. And of course we know that military service in the American Revolution becomes an increasingly poorer and poorer enterprise as the middle class withdraws and withdraws from service. And it's this tension that's, I think, remarkable in these letters, and we associate women with domesticity supposedly in this time period, but it's male domesticity which is held up, and the responsibilities of patriarchy that have to do with the household over public life, which create this tension and anger between different kinds of men who, certain men look at other men as failing their countries, other men look at other men as looking as failing their families. And so this discussion is rather remarkable in these letters, and I don't have these letters for you, but there are thousands of them, and they're rather amazing. And the last thing, or close to the last thing I want to say, is just that the difficulty that people had in this era of living inside an event. When there's an event like a revolution and a war that's so much larger than yourself, puts such intense demands, can last a long time, and this was once one of the longest wars, never mind a revolutionary period in American history. It required extraordinary sacrifice and stamina, and people had a very wanted life. They didn't want to be in an event anymore. They imagined that life that came before the event, and they imagined that life that came after the event. And other people wanted the event to be the most important thing that ever happened to them. And that relationship between life and event I find really fascinating in these letters, and where people want to be in the event and where people want to be in life, and refer to things outside of what they're experiencing. And that's what these letters describe. Battles, for instance, and the arduousness of battles, the suddenness of battles, since war happens in very odd intervals in this time period, very erratic intervals, and they describe life outside of what they're experiencing. What they're experiencing matters so much, but the rest of life constantly appears in their letters, and it's that tension that I find particularly fascinating, and I'll come to an end. And so here, letter writing, I think, intersects with extraordinarily difficult things in this time period. One is the process of organizing a revolution, which is an extremely, extremely difficult thing to do in human history and a very rare thing in human history. And I think letter writing was absolutely crucial to the committees of correspondence that form, to the function of the Continental Congress, even to the failed efforts of the British imperial government to hold the empire together in the revolutionary process and through the process of organizing a war. Again, George Washington has four secretaries effectively, through much of the war. He has his own post office, effectively, that it followed. The Congress creates a post office for him in 1776 that always follows him around because he has to have so many letters coming in and going out. So he has a mobile post office for much of the war. In the revolutionary moment, it's especially, letter writing becomes crucial for defining who's an ally and who's an enemy in what was a very, very difficult process, which is always the case in a revolutionary experience. And you can see this again in Egypt when they're trying to figure out who in the crowd is an agent of the government and who's the crowd, who's a provocateur, who's just trying to make the demonstrators become violent to discredit the demonstrators, et cetera, et cetera. Who are these people? And this was a very, very difficult question for much of the revolutionary period before the war. It's very important for protecting and preserving families and how families are going to continue. John Adams and Abigail Adams have the famous letters about how Abigail Adams is running the household during his long absences for so many years and how difficult that process was, even in that shared enterprise. And this is magnified for so many families in this time period, in a war that takes 8 years and in sacrifices that extend considerably longer than that. And the difficulty of sustaining military and civilian morale. Letters during the war are read for what's happening out there. Is it good or is it bad? I can't tell you, or I shouldn't tell you too much, or please tell everyone, read my letter aloud to everyone in town so that they know what's going on. And so you have all these concerns about how do you sustain this effort when it is so extraordinarily difficult and time consuming. And in all these phases, I think letter writing becomes really important. And then that will lead me to my close. I'm going to skip, this is George Washington. This is just how many pieces of paper were circulated. This is George Washington making sure that every month, every regiment has 400 sheets of paper, and it becomes not enough in 1776, just to keep on writing, just to manage the war and to continue all the operations of war. So they're just in order. But the next one is important because it's about the surrender. This is George Washington writing in Yorktown, Virginia, writes a letter saying Cornwallis has surrendered. The next document is, it arrives in 5 days in Philadelphia. Continental Congress finds out, can cheer and be happy. This very same time, George Washington can do this, sends a letter. 5 days is pretty quick to get it from Yorktown, Virginia to Philadelphia, given the terrain, et cetera, et cetera. In the meanwhile, the British government Imperial government in New York is trying to secretly, under cover of night, send a message somehow in a whaleboat across the Delaware Bay to Yorktown, and that's all they have left. They have 2 men in duffel coats trying to sneak a letter somehow and communicate with their own commanding officer at Yorktown, and they have nothing left of the communications infrastructure that they once had. And George Washington has a mobile post office and everything else. And I think that becomes an underappreciated element of how the war was won in an effective way in this time period. And so this letter, the speed of the arrival of this letter, while the British government was hiding letters in a boat with 2 men on the Delaware Bay, trying to get across the Delaware Bay, that it just is a real study in contrast in how things change between 1776 and then 1781, and of course 1783, when the peace treaty is signed.